Dad graduated from Princeton and went to Harvard Law School. And he was a lawyer for a while. And then when Grandpa Franks, who worked for the Carnegie Corporation, Grandpa Franks was Mr. Andrew Carnegie's treasurer. He was the treasurer of the Carnegie Corporation. So that's why I have connections at Carnegie Hall, because Grandpa Franks was so connected with the Carnegie Corporation. So Dad helped do what Grandpa Franks was doing after Grandpa Franks died. My grandfather Walker, Norman Stewart Walker, was in investments, and he had a seat on the stock exchange, and he had a company called Walker Brothers, and they invested. That's what Grandpa Walker did. Grandpa Walker knew I was born. He died 4 days after I was born, so I never knew him, but he knew I was here. That's all I know about Grandpa Walker. The first job I had was for New York Life Insurance Company. I got $56.22 a week. A lot of money in those days. They gave you lunch. You ate at New York Life. I never really looked for a career in a profession. That wasn't what people did in those days. My mother ran a household. You know, everybody's mother ran a household. Very few women worked in those days. Some did, but it was not the norm. So it never occurred to me to get a really, really good job. I then worked for a company called the Play of the Month Guild, which I assigned theater tickets in New York City. And the last job I had before I met Carl was working at a ski lodge in Vermont, Johnny Seesaw's. I was the reservations person at Johnny Seesaw's in Peru, Vermont, which was a lot of fun. That was a great job. Well, because of Dorset and skiing at Big Bromley, Bromley is about 20 minutes away from Dorset, and I learned how to ski at Dorset when we were up in Dorset. When I was at Smith, I'd go up to Dorset in the winter, and then I went up to Big Bromley, and then I was taught how to ski in my teens. And then I took Kutch up there skiing, and I taught Kutch how to ski. And one day, we were in New York City. We already had graduated and still went up to Vermont to ski. The first year I was out of college. And Kutch and I were skiing, and in those days you didn't have release bindings, you had thongs. And I caught an edge and I broke my right leg in 16 places, compound comminuted. That was in 1953. And in 1953, the practice of orthopedics was medieval. They operated on my leg. It got an infection, and I had 25 operations. They're trying to get rid of the infection by scraping the bone. Well, of course, now you use antibiotics. You don't scrape a bone. So that's how it all started, all those series of surgeries. Was with that first break skiing. And I still have rods in my tibia. They finally got rid of 25 years later, the infection with antibiotics, but it took a long time. Almost the only time in my entire life I didn't have an appetite, and they finally said to Mother, you know, you can bring Marnie anything she wants to eat. So Mother said, what do you want to eat? I said, oysters and rhubarb. And I ate oysters and rhubarb. I lived on morphine. I mean, this was very painful what they were doing. And morphine was what you were given. You weren't given the drugs they have today that are a great deal stronger, morphine. And one night, the lady gave me a shot of morphine, and in pulling out the needle was barbed. So, of course, it really, really hurt when she pulled the needle out. And she apologized, and I said, you didn't mean to do this. I mean, I understand. And the room, she left, and I was in a single room, and the room was dark. And I lay in bed. I'm 21 years old, and I think, why? Why am I going through weeks and weeks of this pain and suffering? What is the purpose of this? Can I just ask you a favor? God, would you just take away the pain so I can go to sleep right now? And what happened right then was the room was completely filled with light. And I had a spiritual thought, this is happening to me for a reason. I don't know why, but whatever God has in mind, it's going to be okay. I will understand what's happening. And all of my life, I've had that belief that what has happened to me surgically was meant to happen so I can help other people who are going through that experience. It was an amazing experience, just an amazing experience. My belief today, why I went through all that, is to show people you can do anything you want to do, regardless of your physical situation, if you want to do it enough. And to be able to help other people who are going through physical and or mental or whatever issues they're going through, to help them, if I am able to, with their issues in their life, to show them you're the one who makes the decisions in your life. You're the one who creates your life. Well, I went to rehab free at New York Life, which was really, really nice. And I dated all sorts of people, and I ended up being engaged to a young man who had been an usher in my sister's wedding. And he had a problem with alcohol, which I didn't realize. Nobody understood how the disease of alcoholism can affect one. And one night he came after me with a knife. And I was living in an apartment with 2 roommates, and I ran into the bedroom, and luckily one of my roommates understood what was going on, went out into the hall and called the police. And they came and took him, and they took him away to jail for a day. And I always remember it because it happened the day before St. Patrick's Day. And the next day he sent me 100 green carnations. I don't like St. Patrick's Day, and I don't like green carnations. I spent that next day, I did not go to work the next day. I went to Radio City Music Hall because Granny Franks had taken me there, and I felt very comfortable at Radio City Music Hall. And I don't even know how long I spent there. But when I walked out of there, I had decided that will never happen to me again. Kutch called me up and said, you cannot stay in New York City. You have to get out of New York City. And I absolutely agreed with her, and that's when I went up to Johnny Seesaw's and worked in a ski lodge and got out of New York City. I worked for a year at Johnny Seesaw's, and that spring, 1 year later, Mother and Dad were going to Europe, and they said, we'd love to have you come to Europe with us. And I said, I would love to come to Europe with you. And we went on the USS Constitution, and we hadn't been aboard more than an hour when we met 2 couples. It was Carl and his second wife, Nancy, and Carl's parents, Nani and Gusti. And Gusti was Carl's stepfather, and he was an Austrian, and Carl was taking his beloved stepfather to Austria. And Carl's second wife introduced us, so Mother and Dad and I met the Hensel family and the Krolbud family. And I don't think I'd been on the boat 24 hours before I realized that Nancy was attracted to the purser in first class. We were in cabin class. And Carl and I sat one night in the bar, or I don't remember, the living room, wherever we were sitting, and we discussed people who drank and what it does to your family. You're talking about the 1950s. Carl's with his parents, I'm with his parents. Carl is a married man. I mean, there was absolutely nothing going on other than a conversation with somebody, because I couldn't talk a whole lot about what had happened to me. I had to feel safe to talk about what happened to me because it was a terrifying experience. And Carl listened with great interest and got it. And I realized what he was going through with somebody who also was an alcoholic. And in the 50s, what you said was people drank too much. you didn't realize that alcoholism was a disease. I mean, and how serious it was, and how it not only affects the person who's drinking, but the family of the person who's drinking. So Carl and I got to be very, very good conversational friends on the ship. He knew Austria really well because he'd been going there since he was a little boy, when he was 8 years old. And he said, you know what, I'm going to write you a letter and leave it at your hotel so you and your family will know the sorts of things you can eat, what to go see, be sure you don't miss this or that. I said, that would be terrific. So Mother and Dad and I arrived in Vienna, and they'd changed our hotels. We weren't in the hotel that I'd told Carl we were going to stay in. We were put in some other hotel. So we were there for a couple days, and we ended up walking by the original hotel. And Mother said to me, didn't that Carl Hensel say he was going to leave you a note in the hotel? I said, yes, but people don't ever do what they say. Mother said, well, I'm going to go in and ask. So my mother walks into the hotel and said, you know, is there any message for Marnie Franks? They rifled through the papers. Yes, here's a letter. Carl Hensel, if he said he'd write you a letter at this hotel, would write you a letter. And he wrote a letter at that hotel. And we did everything he suggested that we do, which we wouldn't have known without his nice instructions. So I wrote him a letter back when I got home, and I was back up in Vermont working at the ski lodge, and said how nice of him to do that. That was really very, very sweet. We'd met in April of 1956. On the 8th of October of 1956, I'm back in New York City. I have a different job in New York, and Carl calls the apartment, but I'm not there. I'm teaching English as a second language to foreign students. And my roommate said, Carl Hensel called, and he calls back again. And he said, Nancy and I have separated. I'm here on business for a day. Could I possibly see you tonight? And I thought, well, you're not divorced, but you're on your way. Yes. So I lived in a 4-flight walk-up, 555 Madison Avenue at 55th Street in Madison, a wonderful, wonderful townhouse. And as Carl walks around the corner, I thought, oh my golly, I'd forgotten how good looking you are. So we went out dancing, which we'd done on the ship perfectly normally. And we just weren't getting the job done. I mean, it was weird. Couldn't dance worth a darn. I'm still working at the Play of the Month Guild, so I say, you know, I've got to go home. I've got a job. I've got to go home. So he walks me back to my apartment. It's a 4-flight walk-up, and I say, would you like a cup of coffee? And he said, yes, he would. Well, this is very interesting because I don't drink coffee. I don't make coffee. So we walk up the stairs, and I'm thinking, how am I going to handle this when we get up into the kitchen? So we get up into the kitchen, and there is a light bulb hanging on a wire. And Carl Hensel kissed me. And I'd been kissed before, but never the way Carl Hensel kissed me. I heard bells. I mean, I thought, this is really fabulous. What's really funny, Carl Hensel doesn't drink coffee either. So he left and said, you know, I've got to go home tomorrow. Could we have lunch? I said, I've got a job. I can't just play all the time. Well, he talked me into having lunch. So we went out to the Divan Parisienne for lunch. We each had an Eggs Benedict, a Bloody Mary. Halfway through lunch, Carl Hensel said to me, will you marry me? And I said yes. So that is the story of my courtship to a man that I was married to happily, happily, happily for 44 years. We just had it incredible. Incredible. Again, I've told some of these stories to some grandchildren, and I once had this conversation with Devon, my oldest granddaughter. You did what? You had one date? And then you said you'd marry him? If you know, you know. And I knew. I think the thing I admired about him most, what I just shared with you, if Carl Hensel said, I'll meet you at 2, I'll write you a letter, I'll mail the packages for you, Carl Hensel would do it. And in my experience up to that time, I can't say all men did what they said they would do. Carl Hensel If he gave you his word, he did exactly what he said he would do. We were married in New York City. In those days, if you were an Episcopalian, you could not get married within 1 year of your divorce in an Episcopalian church. So we were married in New York City in a congregational church and had our wedding reception at the Colony Club. I think the key to a successful marriage is complete and utter honesty. I never didn't tell Carl the complete 100% truth, and he never didn't tell me the complete. And that way you never have to think, did I tell him about that? Well, I did tell him about that, the way it happened, exactly truthfully, and vice versa. So I think honesty is probably the biggest trait to a happy marriage. I married 5 children and then had 2 daughters, Pam and Heidi. So there were 7 children involved. And our minister, Ed Eilertson at St. Martin's Church, had the suggestion. He said, you and Carl have been married for 25 years. They're children from 3 different mothers. I think it would be very positive for you and Carl to repeat your wedding vows and have all 7 children there. When Carl asked me to marry him, he was wearing a wedding ring. When we left lunch that day, he took off his wedding ring. We walked over to the Hudson River and he threw it in the Hudson River. And that's how we got engaged. So when Carl and I got married, I thought, I am not going to give Carl a wedding ring. He had a wedding ring with Nancy. I'm not going to give him a wedding ring. And I did not. On our 25th anniversary, he didn't know it, but I had made a ring with the Hensel crest. But I had it sized to fit his little finger. So in the middle of the wedding ceremony, with this ring I thee wed, Ed Eilertson, the minister, knew this, and of course I knew this, but Carl was completely taken by surprise that I give him and put it on his little finger, where he wore it for the rest of his life. And when Carl died, I had it sized so it would fit my little finger. So that is the history of the Hensel crest ring. Carl was probably the best squash player in the state of Minnesota. I think he has 39 different titles, was ranked 5th nationally in squash doubles. Loved to play tennis, loved to play golf. I mean, we played all sorts of games together. He loved to play backgammon, cribbage, you know, and we both adored to travel. And we both started traveling. He was 8 and I was 6, the first time either one of us ever went abroad. So, I mean, we just took it for granted. I'm not positive about this, but I think we've been around the world 5 times. So the only continent that I have not visited is Antarctica. We loved to entertain. We were a team. It really was just so much fun to entertain with Carl. And even though we had a cook growing up, I did learn how to cook. If you have 7 children, it behooves you to learn how to cook. So I love to cook. I like most to cook for a party. That's the most fun, to plan a party and cook for a party. I think it's a lot of fun. I like setting the table and arranging the flowers and picking out the china, and all of that part of it I loved. It was a lot of fun. Not so much a menu item, but if I was asked a favorite food, my most favorite dessert is called Floating Island. And Granny Frank's, who also had help, you know, when if I was coming for a meal, Granny Frank's would serve Floating Island, and nobody has ever even heard of it today. And it's sort of a custard on which are meringues, and those are the floating islands. On my 50th birthday, we then had a condo in Keystone, Colorado, and there was a very nice restaurant called The Ranch. So Carl wanted to take me out to dinner to The Ranch for my 50th birthday. Unbeknownst to me, he called the chef at The Ranch and asked him if he knew how to do floating islands. The man had never heard of it. The man looked up the recipe, created floating island. We had a perfectly lovely dinner. I don't remember what dinner was, But, I think I'm going to get a piece of birthday cake. Certainly not. The chef comes out with this bowl of floating island. He was so proud that he had created floating island. So that's my most special recipe, is floating island. As you just mentioned, some people find out they're going to be a parent one way. I found out another way. If you are having a conversation with a man who's been married twice and has 5 children, and you become interested in this man, it occurs to you, you will be a parent. And when I married Carl, Peter was 15, Judy was 13, Carly was 7, Edie was 5, and Rob was 3. So I knew I was going to be a parent.
And did you know anything about parenting?
Nothing. I had babysat. In my day, you got 25 cents an hour to babysit. And I think before I was married, I had babysat maybe 5 times in my entire life. I wasn't the world's biggest babysitter, you knew. I wasn't, I just have to be around small children. So we all sort of learned together. Carly would want to climb a tree, and I wouldn't want him to climb the tree. And he'd say, "Why don't you want me to climb the tree?" I mean, he's 7. I said, "Because you might fall and break your leg." Well, I mean, you don't say to a 7-year-old, you can't climb a tree because you're going to fall and break your leg. I learned. I certainly did have some help. I had a wonderful, Sue Way was a wonderful babysitter. And then when Pam was born, I had help, and when you were born, I had help, and we had a Swedish au pair girl named Vivi. So that was a huge help. Peter lived with us most of the time. Jude spent the summers with us. Carly and Rob came over every weekend and all vacations. And then when he was about 6th grade, Carly lived with us full time, and then a couple of years later, Rob lived with us full time. So. But mainly the trips we took were ski trips. Those were, you started skiing at 3, and we just then skied as a family. We'd go out to Red Lodge, Montana. We'd go up to Lutsen. We'd drive and take ski trips all over the place. So that's why I'm such a big believer in skiing. It keeps a family together. We liked Mexico, and we used to go on spring vacation down to Acapulco, and we rented a house called the Casa Leonor. And we stayed in that house many, many spring vacations in Mexico. It was just incredible. It was wonderful. What was so very, very nice about the Lakeview house, it was right smack dab on Lake Minnetonka, and we had a boat, and we had a dock. So, with all of those children, it was wonderful. There was always something to do. In the wintertime, the pond right behind our house froze, and I don't know who kept the snow off that pond, but the kids could go down there and go ice skating. And Cottagewood in the 60s and 70s was just a perfect place to bring up children. There were just all sorts of children who lived in Cottagewood. So they always had people to play with. I mean, it was just an ideal place to raise a family. I can't think of a nicer place to raise a family than Cottagewood. I think the skill I tried to develop most was to listen. Not always tell them what to do, but hear what they wanted to do. And I was always a fan. I went to football games and baseball games and piano recitals and plays, and whatever somebody was in, Carl and I would be in attendance. And that hasn't quit. Yesterday I was at Buck Hill watching my youngest granddaughter in a ski race, so I mean, I'm still doing that. Big fan. Carl Hensel took photographs of everybody doing everything. If you were brushing your teeth, Carl Hensel would take your picture. And we would hire professional photographers. Said how you dress is very, very important. With as many children and as many people as you have in a photograph, if you can all dress alike, then what stands out is the faces of the people in the photograph. Well, Carl Hensel, I think our Christmas card list numbered close to 500 people. And Carl felt very, very strongly that a personal note be written on each card. Well, guess who wrote the notes? Carl Hensel did not write the notes. So we would take these family photographs in these different colored shirts with the blue jeans, and that would be our Christmas card. And I'd start in September. You write 500 notes, it takes a while. So I decided after Carl died that I was never going to do that again, and I never have. And this past Christmas, I sent out 500 Christmas cards with a push of a button on my computer saying, send. And what happens that doesn't happen with a card that goes in the mail? I bet I heard from 25 people back who wrote me a note on their computer when they got that email Christmas letter from me. People don't write you a note back for a Christmas card if they get it in the mail. So it has some advantages sending a Christmas card by email. I don't mind at all that I send a Christmas card by email. It's a lot easier. The biggest heartache that happened to our family was when my stepson Carly, called Charlie, Carl and I called him Carly, but he also was called Charlie, was diagnosed with lung cancer. He was married and had 2 children, Devin and Carl. Devin was 15 and Carl was 9. And Carly had been given a diagnosis of 9 months. Then Carly died 9 months after he was diagnosed. He and Dee Dee had separated at this time, so he was living with us. And in the Cottagewood house was this wonderful year-round porch that looked out over Lake Minnetonka. So we had a hospital bed put into that porch so he could look out and his friends could easily come and visit him. And the courage he showed was just unbelievable. I had never been with anyone before who was dying. And after his death, I thought about it often. The guts he had in talking to Carl and me about his death. I mean, not everyone, certainly if you're 41 years old, is prepared to talk about their death. I mean, it was just amazing that he was so open and honest about that. And that is the biggest heartache that's ever occurred in our family. I mean, we still miss him. And it was over 20 years ago. So it was very, very difficult.